Welcome to Violence Free Colorado's Foundations of Acrity. An accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed lens, or Acrity, is how we approach advocacy and ongoing education when working with survivors.
We acknowledge the current land where Violence Free Colorado is located, on which we are learning, working, and organizing today is traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Oshkosheko, and Ute people and First Nations. We also acknowledge that due to forced relocation and removal, these lands have been populated by multiple Indigenous peoples, and that our understanding of the occupation of these lands are mostly from a colonized perspective. We encourage you to use the link provided to learn more about the lands that you currently reside on and where you have resided in the past.
The purpose of land acknowledgements is a celebration of Indigenous presence and creates a space to reflect on the connection and relationships we have to all things.
This includes reflecting on the privileges we hold and taking accountability for our individual and historical connections and experiences that intersect with colonialism, violence, and oppression. When doing anti-violence work, we believe it's important to address the historical uses of power and control and its connection to gender and racial-based violence, and the concepts of ownership of land and people. It's important to identify how these exist in our current societal structures and the relationships that we have to that. Lastly, land acknowledgements honors our trans, Black, Indigenous relatives and ancestors who were and are the leaders in intersectional anti-violence work. Land acknowledgements require intention, reflection, and action. The real work is in between the webinars, trainings, and activities. Some examples include talk about Indigenous people in the present tense. This is still home to many Indigenous people. Always ask who feels empowered by land acknowledgements. If it's not Indigenous people, it's perpetuating oppression. Do your own research to recognize privileges of the land that you are occupying, histories, treaties, and how things came to be. Connect with your local Indigenous-led organizations to center Indigenous knowledge in non-exploitive ways. Intentionally and financially contribute to Indigenous organizations and resources, which might include offering free access or membership to your organization. Learn how to pronounce tribal and land name. Pronunciation guides may be available on websites. And lastly, be uncomfortable within and question current systems, as this can be an opportunity to create movement towards ending all forms of oppression.
It's important to know all organizations may not identify as anti-violence organizations or center anti-oppression work. However, the primary focus is on supporting all survivors and creating access to all our services. Language holds power, and over time, terminology has changed and will continue to do so. The language that survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault use reflects their complex experiences of trauma, oppression, and resilience within a constantly changing society. The Acrity framework was created by the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, which is a special issue training and technical assistance center focused on the intersections on domestic violence, trauma, mental health, and substance use. Violence Free Colorado uses the term Acrity throughout training materials. You may also hear us use the term advocacy, and we mean people who work with and provide support to survivors. We can use this in the broadest sense. It might depend on the organizations, agencies, and systems we are operating in. Acrity stands for accessible, which means that people with all kinds of abilities are able to fully access our agencies, including our information and resources, environments and spaces, and services and support. Culturally responsive means proactively integrating meaningful attention to the cultural identities of participants and staff, and to the ways culture can shape people's experiences of trauma and healing. Trauma-informed describes an approach that recognizes the pervasiveness and impact of trauma on survivors, staff, organizations, and communities, and ensures that this understanding is incorporated into every aspect of an organization's administration, culture, environment, and service delivery. This is the National Center's Tools for Transformation to guide organizations with implementing Acrity principles. We will be highlighting their key perspectives and core principles. The tools for transformation are easily accessible for organizations. It is encouraged to work on it in pieces over time and not feel pressured to do it all at once.
In anti-violence work, it's crucial to recognize that oppression operates on many levels. Here's a short video that explains the different levels of oppression.
Oppression. It's a word that's often used as a blanket term, but there's actually a whole lot more to it. There are 4 interlocking aspects of oppression: ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. And it might seem like a small difference, but it's very important to be able to distinguish between each kind, because understanding oppression is the first step to fighting it. Let's start with the core at the heart of every form of oppression: ideology. Every system of oppression comes from the idea that one group is somehow better than another. Ideological oppression starts when the dominant group associates positive qualities with itself and negative qualities with the marginalized or othered group. Ideological oppression describes the deeply ingrained social root of inequality. It's the larger overarching idea that leads to the isms. For example, the idea that black people are dangerous is ideological racism. The idea that poor people are lazy is ideological classism. Ideological oppression leads to institutional oppression. Institutional oppression is the way that systems and institutions manifest the dominant ideology. Institutions control access, who is able to get to what and how. This includes legal rights, police practice, access to medical care and education, public policy, political power, and media representation. For example, when women make 2/3 of what men make, that's institutional sexism. When a building is constructed without wheelchair ramps, that's institutional ableism. All of this leads to interpersonal oppression. Interpersonal oppression is probably the easiest to recognize because it happens all around us. Interpersonal oppression is the way that people play out discrimination and violence on each other. It can take the form of microaggressions, jokes, stereotypes, and harassment. For example, when a student is bullied for being gay, it's interpersonal homophobia. When a Muslim person is told that they're a terrorist, it's interpersonal Islamophobia. And all those forces, ideological, institutional, and interpersonal, lead to internalized oppression. Internalized oppression is the way that people with marginalized identities internalize narratives of their own inferiority. It's what leads people to feel less than. This is the end goal of oppression. The oppressive party doesn't need to exert force any longer because the marginalized group is enacting oppression on itself to maintain the status quo. It's important to remember that it's never a marginalized person's fault that they feel internalized oppression. It's simply what happens when someone faces negative stereotypes, low expectations, and ongoing discrimination. So, for example, an immigrant feeling embarrassed about having an accent is internalized xenophobia. When a trans woman feels that they can never be a real woman, that's internalized transphobia. So, to review, the 4 I's of oppression are ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Each of these types are interconnected and completely supported by the others. They can never exist on their own and can even be seen as a cycle. Now that you understand the different kinds of oppression, you're even more equipped to fight it. Don't forget that any effort to dismantle oppression should aim to address it at all 4 of these levels. Thanks for watching.
It's natural, especially when working with systems, to not share every part of your identities with everyone we encounter. It might not be safe, or it might feel vulnerable, or it might become a barrier to accessing services. Let's talk a little bit about perspective and multiple truths. Here's an example. Imagine that this mug is resting on my palm, and this side of the mug is facing you. I'm going to ask you to describe what you see. Go ahead and take a moment to make a list. My turn. I see a handle, a glare, a tall mug, a blank surface. We are witnessing the same thing from different perspectives. When you were describing what you see, I'm sure it included a tree, a cage, birds, words. This was not my experience, even though we were looking at the same thing. Reality of it is, both truths can exist at the same time. I may never see it from your perspective, and you may never see it from mine, and that's okay, because both experiences can remain true. This is the approach that we need to be taken when working with survivors. Their experience may not be one of your own, but we must always believe their perspective. So we talked about how ending oppression means addressing it on all 4 levels. and knowing that they are all interconnected and don't exist on their own, and that multiple truths can exist. We take these into our discussion about intersectionality. Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. Kimberly Crenshaw. Some examples of intersectionality could be race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, language, religion, ability, sexuality, mental health, age, education, body size, and so much more. We as advocates exist within these intersections as well. It's important to always have self-awareness about our own identities, biases, privileges, and what we carry with us into our work. We can always ask ourselves, what might be uncomfortable for me when looking at intersectionality? What might I relate to? And how are these interconnected? It's important to hold multiple truths in order to take accountability for the privileges that we do have. This image addresses intersectionality through a wider lens. When working with any survivor, consider all of the different places where identities intersect: systemic factors, relationality, personal contextual factors, different isms, and cultural dimensions.
When doing anti-violence and anti-oppression work, we support collective healing by intentionally centering accessible, culturally responsive, trauma-informed practices and policies. For example, we can recognize that Acrity principles apply to our work with survivors, staff, and staff survivors. We can incorporate regular trainings for all new staff and volunteers, and we can review hiring practices for inclusivity. We can also do this by acknowledging survivors' unique experiences found at the heart of gender and racial-based violence and other intersectional oppressions. A few ways to do that can include provide regular training on anti-violence and anti-oppression work, as well as how these intersect with domestic violence. Provide trainings on intersectional identities and how survivors are impacted individually and systemically. Support survivors to identify what community healing means to them. Our responsibility as anti-violence organizations is to collectively engage in a process of individual and organizational reflection, collaboration, and intentional action to end all forms of oppression. We can find guides like the National Center's Tools for Transformation to support your organization through these conversations and changes. We can use reflective supervision that incorporates intersectional conversations. We can regularly review our internal documents and materials shared with survivors for harmful language and bias, as well as accessibility. And we can provide resources that are relevant to survivors' unique identities, such as various power and control wheels and specific safety planning tactics. Now we are going to delve into the key perspectives and core principles that the National Center provides for us. The key perspectives are the outer four circles, and the core principles are the inner circle. We will start with the outer key perspectives. Our ability to expand our lens and perspectives is crucial for supporting survivors. The key perspectives consider are human rights and social justice, culture and community, domestic violence advocacy, and trauma-informed. It is important that when we create spaces that center accessibility, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed practices, we must continually attempt to understand how we are interconnected with the world and people in complex ways. Our individual and systemic perspectives will be different depending upon the demographics you serve, organizational locations, and your personal beliefs and values. All of these influence how we are approaching practices, policies, and protocols, and ultimately survivors.
The first key perspective we will talk about is human rights and social justice lens. Trauma has a long legacy, and violence and oppression shifts over time. When we incorporate this lens, we can center all the ways that survivors can identify justice. Incorporating this lens ensures that there is awareness of the conditions that create and uphold abuse, violence, oppression, and discrimination in our lives and in our communities. This includes understanding the different levels of oppression, ideological, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized, and all of the ways that survivors may experience these in their lives. We have individual, community, and systemic responsibilities to actively dismantle and break the long legacies of trauma. Therefore, we must have flexibility in how we respond. Next is cultural, historical, and community lens. Let's call this our roots. The purpose of this lens helps us recognize the richness and complexities of people's identities, beliefs, experiences, and the traditions, values, and relationships that serve as sources of meaning, strength, and resilience, knowing that our connections to each other matter for community healing. For example, this may include recognizing communication styles, generational connections, forms of prayer, ancestors, ceremonies, and daily practices. Unaddressed legacies of colonization undermines the creation of healing center and trauma-informed systems. We may not understand the same connection to culture and community or have different historical experiences as a survivor, but we must honor, believe, and know that survivors' experiences are real and valid. Key to this perspective is self-awareness of our role, positionality, and privileges. Next is domestic violence advocacy. We know that there is trauma associated with domestic violence and sexual assault in ongoing forms of coercion and power and control dynamics perpetuated by an abusive partner or partners. In order to support survivors now, we must also understand the creation of domestic violence services. Historically, domestic violence programs centered survivors who identified as white, middle-class, cisgender women. Anti-violence organizations did not consider the multiple forms of oppression and violence that survivors experienced, which limited access to support or created programs that perpetuated harm. For example, it was not considered how racism increases the risk of violence against women of color and trans women, or that gender-based violence includes violence against our non-binary, trans, and two-spirit relatives. The equity work we do must emphasize the importance of holding individuals and systems we work with accountable for the ways that we have intentionally or unintentionally perpetuated abuse and power.
We then transition to the trauma-informed lens. Healing is not linear, which means that we must meet folks where they are in their process. This lens must take into consideration how human rights and social justice, community and culture, and domestic violence intersect in ways that trauma is experienced individually and collectively. The basis of this knowing is that society has historically had power and control over who gets traumatized and how people are allowed to respond to trauma. In this lens, it's important to normalize trauma responses in all forms and understand that trauma is relational. This could be someone escalating or being avoidant. Fight, flight, or freeze can look different in many ways. It takes into consideration how complex trauma can be and the impact that it has not only on survivors, but our organizations, our communities, and ourselves. As people supporting survivors, it's our responsibility to continually reflect on what we can do to help mitigate those effects. Why does this all matter? In order to know where we're going, we must know where we've been. Historically, the movement to end domestic violence has largely focused on white, middle-class, cisgender women. Unfortunately, this left out a mass amount of survivors and did not fully incorporate a full understanding of intersectional trauma, which is directly linked to human rights and social justice. This limited the ways organizations were able to support all survivors.
Now we will address the core principles, which are the inner circles. The core principles recognize and honor the importance of relationship and connections, survivor-defined approaches, physical and emotional safety, and hope and resilience. First is relationship and connections. We know that harm occurs in relationships and is a betrayal of trust. Our methods to cope, grow, and thrive are usually in relationship to people, places, practices, and things. The core of our advocacy with survivors needs to be relational. This means we have a responsibility to be honest, transparent, and consistent. We must relate in ways that are genuinely respectful, collaborative, and non-hierarchical, which are essential to building safety and trust. Our interactions and relationships have potential to facilitate healing, connection, and belonging, which counteracts people's experiences of trauma and dehumanization. Next is survivor-defined approach, where survivors have choice and control over their experiences. As advocates, we must continue to evaluate if our services are what survivors and their families tell us they need. It's important to know advocates automatically hold power in their role and must continually work to acknowledge and confront the power imbalances in our interactions. Additionally, there are multiple layers of identities and societal locations that influence both advocates and survivors' interactions and relationships. For example, a white advocate working with a survivor of color has a different power differential than a white advocate working with a white survivor. Therefore, advocates' roles include working to change the conditions that facilitate violence in our relationships and communities. And in order to do so, we must understand how these power differentials exist and the impact that they have.
Moving on to physical and emotional safety. In addition to physical safety planning, we also need to consider the multiple layers of emotional safety, especially through the lenses of trauma-informed, human rights and social justice, and culture and community. Emotional safety includes the services that we're offering to survivors with attention to culture and accessibility. So what does this mean? How are we preparing our staff for conversations regarding race, accessibility, pronouns, and historically loaded language? And is there ongoing self-reflection and evaluation of whether systems, policies, and procedures are facilitating feelings of safety among survivors and staff? Lastly is hope and resilience. This must include accessible and culturally responsive reflection. Otherwise, we will miss people's hope and resilience. We need to be intentional to how we are witnessing each other and survivors, knowing that survivors have the capacity to heal, and they are the experts about their needs and what has worked for them. The hope is to create relational environments that honor and support each person's experience, resilience, and agency. We've discussed the foundational pieses of Acrity. So how do we implement these? Here's a powerful quote. "There is a significant difference between all are welcome here and this was created with you in mind." Give yourself a moment to think about what this difference means and how we are implementing our services with "this was created with you in mind." When we say that all are welcome, it doesn't address specific survivors' needs. When we say "this was created with you in mind," it means having intention about specific survivors' needs and flexibility with our services. Many systems were created with the foundation of all are welcome here, but unintentionally left out many survivors. This creates gaps in our services, and it's important to reflect on how we are supporting all survivors and using intention to create services.
To demonstrate this, here is an image you may have seen before. There are 3 versions of this image. Starting from the left, we have equality, equity, and then liberation. So everyone is watching the same ball game, but there is this fence, a barrier. People are individually having their own experience with it. The first one is equality, where everyone is given the same resource despite their different needs. An example of this in our work could be intake paperwork, which is typically offered to survivors primarily in English. Transitioning to equity. Equity is they can all see the ball game now because there is intention for individual experiences and needs. Many would say that all 3 people can participate and watch the game now. However, the barrier remains, and there may be additional barriers that we are not considering, such as, does everyone understand the game that they are watching? Going back to the example of the intake paperwork, it can be offered in multiple different languages besides English, but we want to make sure that we are not assuming survivors have the literacy skills to read or complete the paperwork. The last one is liberation, and this is the action of intentionally removing barriers in order to meet the needs of everyone where they're at. In this image, the fence is removed and all 3 people are watching the game. Back to our example of the intake paperwork, liberation can be a regular reflection about survivors' needs through an accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed lens, and a regular reflection on how our intake paperwork may cause barriers. Within equality, equity, and liberation, it's important to remember that privilege is always present. For example, in the image, the tallest person could watch the game the whole time. The concept of liberation is an intentional process and goal, but it's not an all or nothing process as we keep moving towards change. Liberation and justice are intentional, survivor-centered, and actions. In this image, the focus is on dismantling systems and barriers to pursue justice, which is part of the process of liberation. Justice is always defined by individual survivors. When thinking about justice, we must always consider privilege and ask, who has the privilege to attempt to remove barriers? Who has less harm or is taking fewer risks to remove barriers? Who has the tools and privilege to access justice and liberation? In a wider societal lens, whose job is it to change and dismantle oppressive systems that don't meet survivors' needs?
We talked about equality, equity, liberation, and justice, and the importance of being intentional about the services we offer. We want to highlight the importance of intention versus impact. Intention and impact might not always align, therefore we need to be very mindful of our impacts, both negative and positive. When they don't align, even our best intentions can create more barriers and cause harm. However, perfection is not the goal. Liberation is an ongoing process and one that requires input, collaboration, and connection with survivors. An example of our intentions and policies not matching our practices could be that we may choose to display a safe space symbol with the intention to inform survivors that our services and staff are welcoming, safe, and have knowledge to work with trans, non-binary, two-spirit, and queer survivors and survivors of all gender identities. But if a survivor accessing services is constantly misgendered, then practices are not matching the intention, and the impact is that people may not return for our services. To put all of what we've learned into practice, let's look at some examples of trauma-informed, survivor-centered best practices that can be used across most types of services offered to survivors. Being trauma-informed and survivor-centered means that we don't make assumptions about survivors' needs and that we create services with multiple options for accessibility. It also means recognizing that most people don't know how systems work until they are in a crisis and experiencing trauma, which also impacts the logistical parts of our brains. We must not hold on to expectations or outcomes or take it personally if survivors don't or can't do some of the tasks that might look to us as easy or the right thing to do. We need to take trauma into consideration and what each individual's survival tactics and healing processes look like. Let's consider pronouns and gender identity. Understand that misgendering someone is a form of violence. We also want to normalize asking pronouns and using gender-neutral pronouns when speaking and on our forums. Most importantly, practice internally to prepare for these conversations. Next, let's consider accessibility and what we are consistently offering survivors. Accessibility can mean many things, including our environment, which can include our physical space, as well as how it makes people feel to be in our services. It also includes communication about our services, like on our website, on our signage, on materials given to survivors, and community presentations or training materials. And it can also include being mindful about the words we use. Person-first language centers personhood before disability and is usually the default option. Identity-first language is born from the disability pride movement and centers disability while still recognizing personhood. It's important to ask and have survivors choose the language they would like you to use. For language accessibility, it's important to use non-academic language for different levels of language and literacy comprehension, to use image descriptions for screen readers, to use images and documents for visual learners, and have access to languages other than English. These are common best practices, and there are also additional trauma-informed consideration, but this is not an exhaustive list. Every survivor's specific needs are different, and it's important to prioritize survivors' needs, which may mean rethinking organizational or systemic expectations. Some disabilities, for example, may not be visually noticeable, and some survivors may not be aware they are experiencing some impacts of trauma. This includes traumatic brain injuries or TBIs, and we know there is a high correlation of survivors of domestic violence who may have TBIs, whether they are diagnosed or not. This impacts how survivors access, comprehend, and follow through with services. It's also important to have transparency in systems navigation, both internally and externally. Internally, transparency eases anxiety and can help with crisis management so survivors know what to expect. It builds trust between survivors and service providers and helps reduce organizational burnout for staff. And externally, transparency helps build trust between service providers and community partners. There's also privilege in knowing how systems work. We have systemic knowledge and connections and can share this with survivors. Survivors also have contact with many systems and services, which all have different rules for confidentiality. Every service provider has the responsibility to explain their own limits of confidentiality to survivors and to be able to explain the limits of confidentiality of other service providers that survivors may have contact with. For example, community-based advocates have different limits to confidentiality than folks working in hospitals or court settings.
Action steps. What are some things that we can do to promote working with an Acrity lens and to improve connections with survivors and community partners and improve our own internal work with survivors? We'll start with connection and alignment with survivors. To support survivors, the most important thing we could do is listen to survivors' needs and support their choices and have transparency about how to access services. We can ask for feedback from survivors about our services, share how feedback will be used, and then compensate them for their time and expertise. Next is connection with community partners. It's important to use trauma-informed and survivor-centered language when talking with other service providers and community partners about survivors and their needs. Notice which programs or systems your organizations interact with or collaborate with most, and ask, do you have regular cross-trainings to stay updated about the services offered? Where are places to streamline referrals and access for survivors? How could you improve or implement warm handoffs? How do you explain how your own services work and how community partner services work? And how is survivors' confidentiality maintained between different services and systems? Lastly is internal work. Intake paperwork can be both internal and a way to promote connections with community partners. It can be helpful to share and discuss your intake paperwork, to learn what information survivors are asked when accessing various services, and you can collaborate to make any needed changes to support all survivors. Review policies and protocols through an Acrity lens. Notice which survivors are accessing your services and who are not, and how do you want to address these gaps. Regular trainings for all staff to know how to use accessible services to all survivors, such as how to access interpreters or a language line. Ongoing staff education about Acrity principles and practices, including addressing how privilege, oppression, and domestic violence are connected with culture and community, human rights and social justice, and trauma-informed practices. Incorporating practices using pronouns within staff. Use the National Center's toolkit. Organizations can start by answering the initial questions found in the toolkit. Discuss what support staff might need from their supervisors. And we should always be asking in our work, what does oppression have to do with this? Here are some resource links that will be available to you. And in closing, without community, there is no liberation. Audre Lorde. Here are some discussion questions you might want to use to begin thinking about Acrity on a deeper level. Question number 1. What parts of this presentation prompted you to reflect on the work you're doing? 2. Are you currently using Acrity as a lens for your work? If so, what are your strengths and your challenges? 3. If not, what pieces of the Acrity model seem most appealing to you? Which pieces seem most challenging at this time? 4. Are there places your intention and impact might not align in your current work? 5. What is one Acrity thing that you can begin using in your work today? Thank you for your time and your consideration. And as mentioned previously, without community, there is no liberation. Audre Lorde.